February 12, 1952. Harlem. A KKK fugitive grabbed Bumpy Johnson's wife at gunpoint. 200 witnesses stood frozen mouths open, blocking police. 8 minutes passed. No shots fired. No arrests made. One man walked out bleeding. The other walked out untouched. This wasn't rescue or luck, it was power. One razor blade rewrote what law enforcement meant in Harlem. So how did 8 minutes prove silence is deadlier than bullets to understand that moment? The story goes back to where it truly began. Tuscaloosa, Alabama, summer, 1943. Charlie Morrison was 19 when he first pulled the hood over his head. The cloth smelling like kerosene and someone else's sweat baked into the fabric. He didn't join because he believed in crosses burning or blood purity or any of that Sunday sermon hatred. He joined because the barn meetings had whiskey that didn't ask questions and men in white who didn't care that his hands shook when he reached for the bottle. His old man died 3 years back, heart exploding in a cotton field under August sun. They found him face down in red clay with flies already gathering, mouth open like he was trying to eat dirt. His mother remarried inside a month to a man who locked the bedroom door every night and looked at Charlie like he was a stray dog that needed shooting. Charlie slept in the truck bed until September. Rust ate through the frame and rain turned his blankets to black mold. The Klan took him because he showed up, because he'd drink anything they poured and laugh when they laughed. Even when the joke was a man screaming in flames and the smell of burning meat made Charlie vomit behind the barn afterward. That was enough for them. He wasn't special or chosen or destined for anything except desperation. And in 1943 Alabama, desperation wore the same uniform as loyalty. Valdosta, Georgia, February 1951. Charlie Morrison killed a cop over a mason jar of moonshine he didn't even cook. The barn on Route 7 reeked of wet hay and fermenting corn mash. That sweet rot smell that sticks in your throat. Charlie was making a sale. $2 a jar, customer handing him crumpled bills. Then the door exploded inward and a young cop stood there with a fresh badge and a shaking hand on his holster. "Put the jar down," the cop said, and his voice cracked on the last word. Charlie's hands were trembling from 3 days without sleep, and a belly full of his own poison. The cop's hand moved toward his gun. Charlie's moved faster. The shot cracked through the barn like a spine snapping. The cop's chest opened up in a red spray that hit the wall behind him. He stumbled backward, hit the floor hard, his mouth working like a fish drowning in air. Blood pooled black under the kerosene lamp and spread like oil across the dirt floor. The cop's fingers scraped the ground once, twice, then went still. Charlie stood there with the gun hot in his hand and the copper smell of blood mixing with corn mash and his own piss running warm down his leg. Then his brain caught up to his body and he ran. Death row. Georgia State Prison. October 1951. The cell smelled like rust and human waste and fear baked into concrete over decades. 12 men waiting to die in a hallway that never saw sunlight. And Charlie was number 8 on the list. The trial lasted 2 days. Cop killer. White cop at that. And the judge signed the execution order before the bailiff finished reading the verdict. 90 days, the warden told him through the bars. 90 days till we strap you in the chair and cook you till your eyes pop. Charlie didn't pray or write letters or beg forgiveness. He counted instead. 216 bricks in his cell. And he watched the guards, memorized their boot patterns on concrete, learned the 8-foot gap between cell block and exercise yard, studied the fence rusted through at the bottom. He wasn't thinking about salvation. He was thinking about breathing one more day and then escaping into those woods. November 14th, 1951. 4:47 in the morning. The guard rotation changed at 4:45. 2-minute gap that Charlie had watched for 6 weeks straight. When the cell door opened, Charlie moved without thinking. He drove the sharpened fork into the guard's throat before the man could draw breath. Felt it punch through skin and muscle and scrape against vertebrae. Blood sprayed hot across Charlie's face, and the guard's hands clawed at his neck. His mouth opened and closed. No sound except wet choking, and his knees buckled. Charlie stepped over the body while it was still twitching. He took the keys off the belt, warm and slick with blood, and walked. No alarm, no gunfire, just whine through the pines and his own ragged breathing. He stole a Buick in Macon, ditched it in Raleigh, hopped a freight train heading north. By sunrise, he was 2 states gone, moving like smoke through rail yards. Penn Station, February 12th, 1952. The train vomited Charlie into chaos, steam hissing, metal screaming, 10,000 people pushing through marble halls. He bought a city map, studied it under a flickering bulb. His finger stopped on one name: Harlem. The black neighborhood where police didn't patrol after dark and people minded their own business. Perfect, he thought. A place where a white man could slip through cracks and disappear. He was wrong about all of it. He didn't know Harlem wasn't a hiding place. It was a kingdom with borders drawn in blood and walls made of eyes that saw everything. And kingdoms don't forgive trespass. Charlie Morrison thought power lived in guns and badges and gavels pounding wood. He didn't understand that real power is a held breath, a crowd going silent, 200 people deciding not to see what happens next. Charlie thought he was running toward freedom. He was walking into a slaughterhouse with his own name carved on the hook. Penn Station to 125th Street. 15 minutes on the A train. 15 minutes to cross from one America into another that didn't want him breathing its air. Charlie Morrison stood on the platform, gripping a canvas bag with 2 shirts stiff from dried sweat, a stolen wallet, and a .38 revolver that jammed every third trigger pull. The subway screamed into the station, brakes shrieking like something dying, sparks flying from the rails. He climbed on and the doors closed behind him with a pneumatic hiss that sounded final as a coffin lid. The car stank of cigarettes and wet wool and something sour. Half empty. A woman in a church hat staring at her folded hands. 2 men in factory clothes with faces carved from stone. Nobody looked at Charlie directly, but he felt them marking him anyway, felt their awareness like pressure on his skin. The train lurched forward and threw him against a pole. 125th Street. The doors opened and Charlie stepped onto the platform, into air that hit different. Thicker somehow. Grease from a chicken joint mixing with tobacco smoke and something sweet rotting in the gutters. Voices everywhere, overlapping and cutting through each other like knives. He climbed the stairs into sunlight that felt like stepping into an oven. Harlem spread out before him, and it didn't look dangerous. It looked alive in a way that made his skin crawl. Storefronts painted carnival red and canary yellow. A record shop blasting horns and drums that rattled his teeth. Barber pole spinning. A woman in a blue dress laughing on the corner, her voice sharp like glass breaking on concrete. Charlie walked slow, hands buried in his pockets, gun grip slick with palm sweat, trying to look like he belonged. But every face he passed saw him anyway. The man selling newspapers didn't look up, but his eyes tracked Charlie in his peripheral. The kid shining shoes stopped mid-buff and watched Charlie pass. The woman sweeping her stoop paused, broom going still, and her eyes followed him down the block. They didn't stare or point. They just marked him, filed him away in some mental ledger that Charlie didn't understand. He felt it like a noose tightening slowly around his neck. Charlie's math was simple, stupid, but simple. He'd grown up in Alabama, delivered moonshine to black neighborhoods outside Tuscaloosa, where people stepped off sidewalks when white men passed. He'd seen poverty, seen people who didn't fight back. Harlem, he figured, was just that. Bigger, louder, but fundamentally the same. A place where a man with a gun could take what he needed and disappear before anyone noticed. He was wrong about everything. Men like Charlie Morrison are always wrong about the same things. They think silence means surrender. Think bowed heads mean broken spirits. They don't realize silence can be a weapon cocked and waiting. He walked east on 125th Eyes, scanning storefronts. Pawn shop. Too many men inside. Liquor store. 2 cops outside smoking. Diner packed with customers. Windows fogged with grease. Then he saw it. Small tailor shop. Quiet. Clean white curtains. Hand-painted sign above the door. Johnson and Company. Tailoring. Gold letters flaking off. Charlie stopped. Looked through the glass. One woman inside. Older. Black. Gray hair pulled back tight. She was pinning fabric to a mannequin, hands steady. No rush, no customers, no noise, no witnesses. Perfect. He pushed the door and a bell chimed. Sweet and delicate. The woman looked up. Didn't smile or frown. Just looked. Her eyes moved over him like she was measuring him for a suit or maybe a coffin. Help you. Her voice flat. No inflection. Charlie's hand found the gun in his pocket. Yeah, he said, and stepped inside. I need a suit. The woman studied him, her gaze moving slow. His unshaven face, his wrinkled clothes, his hands trembling in his pockets. We're appointment only. She turned back to her work. Come back Thursday. Charlie's jaw clenched. He pulled the gun. Let her see it. I'm not leaving. The woman didn't jump or gasp. She just looked at him again. Longer this time. And then she smiled. Not friendly, not scared, but like she'd just remembered a joke and he was the punchline. Close the door, she said quietly. Lock it. Charlie's throat went dry. What, you heard me? Her voice steady as a blade. You're already here. Might as well do it right. Charlie locked the door. The bolt clicked home, loud as a coffin lid. And somewhere deep in his brain, alarm bells started ringing. But by then it was already too late. Her name was Mayme Hatcher before marriage put Johnson after it. Born 1914. Edgecombe County, North Carolina. Tobacco fields and red clay that stained everything. Childhood ended at 9 when fever took her mother in 3 days. Her father sold their land to pay for a pine box he never came to see lowered. She raised herself after that. At 14, she cooked in a white family's kitchen in Raleigh. Grease burns up both forearms. At 16, she had enough saved for a bus ticket north. One way. The Great Migration wasn't about dreams for girls like Mayme. It was mathematics. Cold and simple. Stay south and die slow. Go north and maybe die trying to live. She picked north. Harlem, 1932. Mayme Hatcher stepped off the bus at Penn Station with $7 and a cardboard suitcase tied shut with clothesline. No family. No friends. No plan except breathe and move forward. She found work at a laundry on 138th Street within 2 days. 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. Her hands raw from lye soap hot enough to blister. At night she sewed. Fixed torn shirts for a nickel. Hemmed dresses for a dime. She learned fast. Harlem didn't care about hard work. It cared about hard seeing. About knowing which smile meant friend and which meant knife in your back. Knowing when to talk and when talking got you killed. By 1935, she'd saved enough to rent a corner of a tailor shop on Lenox Avenue. By 1938, she owned the whole shop. By 1940, she'd met Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. She didn't chase him. Bumpy walked into her shop one Thursday afternoon. Jacket torn, blood soaking through white cotton. Bullet had grazed him. He handed her the jacket without asking. "Can you fix this?" Mayme looked at the jacket, then at him, then at the blood dripping on her floor. "Bullet or knife? Bullet, your blood or theirs? Mine. Then sit before you bleed out on my floor." Bumpy smiled. Not the charming smile he used in nightclubs. The real smile. Rare and hard. "I like you." "I don't care," Mayme said. $20. Cash. No credit. He paid. And came back. By 1952, Bumpy Johnson's shop wasn't just fabric and thread. It was a nerve center, a confessional, a courtroom. People came with problems they couldn't bring to police. She listened and remembered. When Bumpy needed to know who was talking, who was stealing, who was planning to move against him. She told him, because they were partners. February 12th, 1952. 11:43 in the morning. Charlie Morrison's gun hand shook. Bumpy Johnson's hands rested in her lap, steady as stone. "Put the gun down," her voice flat. Clinical. "Shut up," Charlie said, voice cracking. "You're scared," Bumpy said. "I can see it. Your trigger finger's twitching. You've never done this before." "I killed a cop. By accident." She cut him off. "That's different. This is premeditated. And you don't have the stomach for it." Charlie's face flushed red. "You don't know. I know you're not from here," she said. "I know you're running. I know you picked my shop because you thought I'd be easy." She leaned forward. "You thought wrong." Mayme stood, slow and deliberate. "What are you doing?" Charlie said. "Making a phone call." She walked toward the back office. "I said, don't I heard you," she said calmly. "But you're not going to shoot me." "The hell I won't." "No," she said, turning to look at him. "You won't. Because the second you do, you're dead." She walked to the office, picked up the phone, dialed. 3 rings. "Yeah, it's me," Mayme said. "We have a problem." Pause. "What kind?" "White, armed, stupid." Longer pause. "Where?" "Here." "You hurt?" "No." "He alone?" "Yes, I'm coming." "I know." She hung up, walked back, sat down. "Who was that?" Charlie whispered. "My husband." Outside. The street was filling, not with noise, just bodies. A man in a gray suit stopped across the street. A woman with a grocery bag set it down, didn't leave. 2 teenagers leaned against a lamppost. Then more came. They formed a wall, silent, unmoving, not blocking the door, blocking escape. "What are they doing?" Charlie said, voice climbing toward panic. "Witnessing," Mayme said softly. "Witnessing what?" "Your mistake. The biggest mistake you ever made." Charlie Morrison thought he was the hunter, thought Bumpy Johnson was prey. But she'd known from the start. Known Charlie was a dead man the second he walked through her door. She wasn't afraid. She was waiting for him to understand. Because in Harlem, 1952, there were rules. And Charlie Morrison had just broken the only one that mattered. You don't touch Bumpy Johnson's wife. In 8 minutes, a man would walk through that door with a straight razor, and Charlie Morrison would learn the difference between being afraid and being prey. February 12th, 1952. 11:46 in the morning. Bumpy Johnson stood and walked to the front door, moved the open sign to closed, and pulled down the shade with movements so deliberate they looked choreographed. Charlie Morrison watched her with the gun still raised, barrel tracking her across the shop floor, finger trembling on the trigger like a leaf in wind. "What are you doing?" he said, and his voice had gone high and thin, like wire pulled too tight. "Closing," Mayme said without looking at him. "We're closed now. She turned the lock, tested it once to make sure it held, then walked back to her chair and sat down like she'd just finished a completely normal task. Charlie's brain screamed at him that this was wrong, that she shouldn't be calm, that prey doesn't lock itself in with the predator. But his mouth couldn't form the words to ask why. Outside, the first person stopped at the window, an old man in a wool coat despite the February warmth, newspaper tucked under his arm. He looked through the glass at the closed sign, then at Mayme sitting calm in her chair, then at Charlie with his gun. The old man's face didn't change expression. He just stepped to the side of the door and stood there, back against the brick wall, settling in to wait like he had all day and nothing better to do. Mayme picked up a piece of fabric, began pinning it with the same steady hands she'd used before Charlie walked in. The needle pushed through cloth with small, precise movements that made no sound except the whisper of metal through cotton. Charlie's gun wavered, dropped an inch, rose again. He didn't know what to do with a hostage who acted like she wasn't one. "You should sit down," Mayme said, not looking up from her work. "Save your energy. It's going to be a long wait." "For what?" Charlie said. "For whatever happens next," she said, and there was something in her voice that made his bladder clench and his throat go dry. The phone call she'd made kept playing in his head, white, armed, stupid. "I'm coming." He wanted to ask who was coming, but he already knew from the way she'd said "my husband" like it was a title instead of a relationship. From the way people were gathering outside like they'd been summoned by some signal he couldn't hear. From the way time itself seemed to be slowing down, stretching each second into something elastic and terrible. Another person stopped outside, a woman with 2 children, both under 10, both with wide eyes that saw too much. The woman positioned herself and the children away from the door, across the street, but where they could see, not leaving, just watching. Then a teenager in a leather jacket joined the old man against the wall. Then 2 more women. Then a man in mechanic's overalls with grease still on his hands. They weren't shouting or threatening or doing anything except standing there. Silent as gravestones, still as statues, present as judgment. Charlie felt their eyes on him through the glass, felt the weight of their attention like physical pressure against his chest. "This isn't right," he said, and it came out as a whimper. "This isn't how it's supposed to go." "No," Mayme agreed, still pinning fabric. "It isn't. But you made choices, and choices have consequences. And now we're all waiting to see what those consequences look like." She set down her needle, folded her hands in her lap, and looked at him with eyes that held no anger, no fear. Just a kind of patient certainty that made him want to scream. "My husband is coming," she said. "And when he gets here, you'll have decisions to make. Fast ones." "What kind of decisions?" Charlie whispered. "Whether to put that gun down and pray for mercy," she said, "or whether to die stupid." She said it like she was discussing the weather, like his life or death was just another piece of fabric to be measured and cut and sewn into something useful. Sirens cut through the morning air, distant but growing closer. Charlie's head jerked toward the sound, hope flaring in his chest like a match struck in darkness. "The cops," he said. "The cops are coming." "Yes," Mayme said. "They are." Charlie almost laughed, relief flooding through him like whiskey. "See," he said, "they'll arrest me. I'll go to jail. But at least I'll be alive." "At least you don't understand," Mayme interrupted, and her voice was gentle now, almost kind. "The police aren't coming to save you. They're coming to manage what happens after." The sirens grew louder. The crowd outside grew larger. 20 people now, then 30. Then more arriving every minute from shops and apartments and street corners. They formed a semicircle around the tailor shop. leaving space for the police cars to pull up but making it clear that space was temporary, conditional, revocable. Charlie's gun hand shook harder. "This isn't," he started, then stopped because he didn't know how to finish the sentence. "This isn't fair. This isn't legal. This isn't how America works." But he was in Harlem now, and Harlem had its own laws written in blood and silence and collective memory of what happens when you break them. The first police car pulled up at 11:53, 7 minutes after Mayme made her call. 2 officers got out, hands on their holsters, eyes scanning the crowd that had materialized like smoke. The crowd didn't move, didn't speak, didn't acknowledge the police except to stand there in silent witness. The officers looked at each other, and even through the window Charlie could see them understand that this wasn't a normal hostage situation. This was something else entirely. Mayme stood, walked to the window, and raised the shade. 6 inches, just enough for the police to see her face. See she was unharmed. See Charlie behind her with his gun. One of the officers raised a bullhorn to his mouth. The crowd didn't react. They just stood there, and their silence was louder than any shout could have been. And somewhere in the distance, cutting through traffic and sirens and the held breath of 50 people, came the sound of footsteps. Steady, unhurried, inevitable as sunrise. Mayme heard them first and smiled. Charlie heard them second and felt his bowels turn to water. The police heard them last and reached for their guns without knowing why. Time had run out. Bumpy Johnson was coming, and when he arrived, Charlie Morrison would learn that in Harlem. The law was always second to something older and colder and infinitely more permanent. February 12th, 1952. 11:58 in the morning. Captain Robert Henderson had been a cop in Harlem for 16 years, long enough to know when a situation was deteriorating and when it was already lost. This one was already lost. He just didn't know it yet. He stood next to his patrol car with his hand on his service revolver and counted heads in the crowd. 57 people by his first estimate, but more arriving every minute from directions he couldn't predict or control. They weren't rioting or shouting or making demands. They were just standing there, bodies forming a loose semicircle around the tailor shop, faces expressionless, arms crossed or hanging loose at their sides. No weapons visible. No threat spoken. Nothing Henderson could arrest them for except existing in public space, which wasn't a crime even in Harlem. But something about their silence made his trigger finger itch and his stomach clench with the kind of fear that comes from understanding you've lost control without knowing how. Officer Davies, younger, stupider, moved toward the crowd with his nightstick raised. "Move along," he said, voice too loud, too aggressive. "This is a police matter." The crowd didn't move, didn't look at him, just stood there like he'd spoken in a language they didn't understand or didn't recognize as worth responding to. Davies raised his nightstick higher. "I said move," he shouted. Henderson grabbed Davies by the shoulder and pulled him back before the situation turned into something that would require explanations he didn't want to give. "Stand down," he said quietly. "They're not breaking any laws." "But Captain," Davies started. "I said stand down," Henderson repeated, and his tone made it clear that discussion was over. Inside the tailor shop, visible through the window, a black woman sat calmly in a chair while a white man with a gun paced behind her. Standard hostage situation, textbook response, negotiate for release, arrest the perpetrator, file the paperwork. Except nothing about this felt standard. The woman wasn't crying or begging or showing any signs of distress. She was just sitting there like she was waiting for a bus. Like the gun pointed at her back was no more threatening than rain clouds on the horizon. Henderson raised his bullhorn. "This is the police," he said, and his voice echoed off brick buildings and asphalt. "Release your hostage and come out with your hands up." No response from inside. The woman glanced at the window but didn't move. The man with the gun stopped pacing, looked at Henderson through the glass, and his face was pure panic. This was good, Henderson thought. Panic meant the perpetrator was losing control, meant he'd make mistakes, meant this could end without bloodshed. Then Henderson heard the footsteps. Not running. Not hurrying. Just walking. Steady rhythm like a metronome or a heartbeat. Coming from the east down Lenox Avenue. The crowd heard it too because they shifted, not moving away from the shop but repositioning themselves, creating a corridor 10 feet wide that led straight to the tailor shop door. Henderson turned and saw a man walking toward them through the gap in the crowd. He wore a gray suit that probably cost more than Henderson made in a month. Shoes polished to a mirror shine. No hat. His face was scarred on the left side where something sharp had opened his cheek years ago and healed badly. He walked with his hands in his pockets. No weapon visible. No threat in his posture except the absolute certainty that he belonged here and everyone else was visiting his territory on borrowed time. "Bumpy Johnson," Henderson said, and it wasn't a question. Bumpy nodded once but didn't stop walking. Henderson stepped into his path, hand still on his gun. "This is a police matter. Mr. Johnson, I need you to step back." Bumpy stopped 3 feet away, close enough that Henderson could smell his cologne, expensive and foreign, close enough that Henderson could see his eyes, flat and empty as a shark's. "That's my wife in there," Bumpy said. His voice was quiet, conversational, the tone you'd use to discuss baseball scores or weather predictions. So this stopped being a police matter the second it started. Now it's a family matter, and I'd appreciate it if you'd let me handle family business in my own way. Henderson felt sweat running down his back despite the February cold. "Can't do that," he said. "He's armed. She's in danger. Protocol requires protocol." Bumpy interrupted, and now there was something in his voice like ice cracking under weight. "Requires you to contain the situation and minimize casualties. I'm offering to do exactly that. Let me talk to him. Let me get my wife out. Then you can arrest him, or shoot him, or whatever you want to do. And if I don't," Henderson said, hating himself for asking but needing to know. Bumpy smiled, and it was the coldest thing Henderson had ever seen. "Then you'll have to explain to your captain why you let a hostage die because you were more worried about jurisdiction than safety. And after that, you'll have to explain it to 200 witnesses who all remember things differently than you do." His smile widened. "Your choice, Captain." Henderson looked at the crowd, looked at his officers. 4 men with guns against 200 people with nothing except patience and numbers. Looked at the tailor shop where a woman sat calmly while time ran out for everyone involved. He'd been a cop for 16 years, long enough to know when the law mattered and when it was just words on paper that nobody cared about. This was the second kind of moment. 5 minutes, Henderson said. "You get 5 minutes to talk to him. Then we come in regardless." Bumpy nodded like they'd just agreed on a business transaction. "Won't need 5, he said. 3 should do it." He walked past Henderson toward the shop door, and the crowd parted to let him through like water around a stone. Henderson watched him go and understood something he'd spent 16 years trying not to learn. The law worked when people agreed to follow it, but in places like Harlem, it only worked when it aligned with older laws written in blood and kept by men who didn't wear badges. Today, those laws weren't aligned. Today, the badge meant nothing except metal pinned to cloth. Bumpy reached the shop door and knocked twice, polite as a salesman. The sound echoed in the silence. Inside, Charlie Morrison raised his gun with hands that shook so badly he could barely hold it steady. Mayme Johnson stood and walked to unlock the door, and her face showed nothing except the same calm certainty she'd worn since this started. The door opened. Bumpy stepped inside. The door closed behind him, and 200 people stood in absolute silence to witness whatever came next. Because some things needed witnesses even if courts never heard testimony. Henderson holstered his gun and checked his watch. 3 minutes, he thought. Then this gets messier than anything in the manual. But deep down he knew the mess was already decided, already written, already finished before it started. When community stands still, official power starts shaking. And in Harlem, February 1952, the community had made its decision hours before police ever arrived. February 12th, 1952. 12:01 in the afternoon. Bumpy Johnson stood inside the tailor shop with the door closed behind him and studied the man holding a gun on his wife. White, mid-20s, unshaven, eyes red from lack of sleep or drugs or both, clothes wrinkled and stained, hands shaking badly enough that the gun barrel drew small circles in the air, prison tattoos visible on his forearms where his sleeves had ridden up, crude ink that marked him as someone who'd done time and learned nothing from it. Charlie Morrison stared at the man who'd just walked in like he owned the place, and his brain screamed at him to shoot, to pull the trigger and end this before it got worse. But his finger wouldn't move because some animal part of his nervous system understood that shooting Bumpy Johnson would be like shooting a tiger. You might wound it, but it would kill you anyway, and the dying would take longer than if you'd done nothing at all. Bumpy didn't look at the gun. He looked at Mayme, and his eyes did a quick scan that took in her posture, her breathing, the absence of bruises or blood. "You all right?" he said, and his voice was conversational, like he was asking if she'd had lunch yet. "I'm fine," Mayme said. "He hasn't touched me. Just scared and stupid." Bumpy nodded once. "Usually goes together," he said. Then he looked at Charlie, and Charlie felt that gaze like a physical weight pressing on his chest. "What's your name?" Bumpy said. It wasn't a question exactly, more like a formality that needed handling before real business started. "Charlie," the younger man whispered. "Charlie." "What?" "Morrison." "Where you from?" "Charlie Morrison." "Georgia." Bumpy nodded like this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Death row," he said, not a question. Charlie's eyes went wide. "How did you—" "Your eyes," Bumpy said. "You got that look men get when they're already dead, but their body hasn't figured it out yet." Bumpy took 3 steps further into the room, hands still in his pockets, moving with the casual confidence of someone walking through his own living room. Charlie raised the gun higher, pointed it at Bumpy's chest. "Don't," he said, and it came out as a whimper. "Don't come closer." Bumpy stopped but didn't step back. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You're going to put that gun down. Then you're going to walk out that door with the police. They'll arrest you, process you, and Georgia will extradite you back to finish your sentence." Charlie laughed, high and cracked. "I'll shoot you. I'll shoot her. You won't," Bumpy interrupted, "because shooting either of us means 200 people out there come through that door and those windows, and what they do to you will make the electric chair look like mercy." He said it flat, stating facts. No threat in his tone because threats are for people who might not follow through. "I'm not going back to death row," Charlie said. "Then you're dying here," Bumpy said. "Only question is how fast and how much it hurts. Me, I prefer clean and quick because I'm not sadistic. But those people outside—" He gestured toward the window. "Some of them lost family to men in hoods like the ones you used to wear. They'll take their time. They'll make it educational." Charlie's gun hand dropped an inch. "How do you know about?" "'Cause I know everything that happens in my territory," Bumpy said. "Know you killed a cop in Valdosta. Know you killed a guard in Georgia State. Know you rode a freight train north thinking Harlem was a place you could hide." He pulled his right hand from his pocket, and Charlie tensed, but Bumpy was only holding a straight razor. still folded, looking more like jewelry than a weapon. "No, you picked the wrong shop to rob. Put the razor away," Charlie said, voice climbing toward hysteria. Bumpy shook his head. "Can't do that. See? We're past the negotiation part now. Now we're at the part where you make a choice. Put the gun down and take your chances with the law. Or keep holding it and take your chances with me." He opened the razor with a smooth, practiced motion, blade catching light from the window. "Won't take long either way. But one option leaves you breathing, and the other doesn't." The gun was getting heavier in Charlie's hand, his arm aching from holding it up, his whole body trembling from adrenaline and fear, and the growing understanding that he'd walked into something he couldn't walk out of. Behind Bumpy, through the window, Charlie could see Captain Henderson checking his watch, could see the crowd standing still as cemetery stones, could see his own future narrowing to a point where every choice led to pain. "I'll shoot your wife," Charlie said, and it was his last card, his only leverage. Bumpy's expression didn't change. "Then I'll cut you apart slowly while she watches. And every person out there will testify you attacked me first. Self-defense. Justifiable homicide. Case closed." He took another step closer. "Or you put the gun down now and I let the cops take you. Clean. Legal. Boring." 30 seconds passed in silence. Charlie's mind raced through scenarios, calculations, desperate plans that all ended the same way. The gun felt like it weighed 100 pounds. His arm was shaking so badly he couldn't aim anymore even if he wanted to. And Bumpy Johnson stood there with a razor and absolute certainty, offering a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. The gun clattered to the floor. Charlie's legs gave out and he dropped to his knees, hands raised above his head, tears running down his face. Bumpy folded the razor and put it back in his pocket. "Good choice," he said. Then he walked to the door and opened it. "Henderson," he called out. "He's ready for you now." 3 officers rushed in, guns drawn, and grabbed Charlie Morrison with hands that weren't gentle. They cuffed him, read him rights he didn't hear, dragged him toward the door. As they passed Bumpy, Henderson stopped. "That was quick," he said. Bumpy shrugged. "Some conversations don't need to be long," he said. "Just clear. Outside." The crowd watched Charlie Morrison get shoved into the back of a police car. Watched the car pull away with sirens silent because there was no emergency anymore. Just clean up. The crowd began dispersing, returning to shops and apartments and lives that would continue as if this had been nothing more than a brief interruption. But everyone who'd stood there would remember, would tell their children and grandchildren about the day Bumpy Johnson walked into a tailor shop and ended a hostage situation without firing a shot. Inside, Mayme locked the door behind the last officer and turned to her husband. "Took you long enough," she said. Bumpy smiled. "Traffic," he said. Then they both started laughing. Not from humor, but from the release of tension that comes after surviving something that could have gone much worse. Real power doesn't ask permission. It just announces what's already been decided. And in Harlem, 1952. Bumpy Johnson didn't need guns or threats or violence. He just needed to walk through a door and make clear that the only acceptable outcome was the one he chose. February 12th. 1952. 12:03 in the afternoon. What actually happened in those final moments inside the tailor shop was different from what Captain Henderson would write in his report, different from what the newspapers would print, different from what 200 witnesses would claim they saw through a window from 40 feet away. Charlie Morrison's gun didn't clatter to the floor because he chose surrender. It clattered because when he pulled the trigger with the barrel pointed at Bumpy Johnson's chest. Nothing happened. The firing pin clicked against an empty chamber, loud in the silence. and Charlie's face went from desperate to confused to absolutely terrified in the span of a single heartbeat. He pulled the trigger again. Click. Again. Click. The .38 revolver that had killed a cop in Valdosta and a prison guard in Georgia had finally jammed exactly when Charlie needed it most. And the sound of that mechanical failure was the sound of his last hope dying. Bumpy Johnson didn't flinch when Charlie pulled the trigger, didn't step back or raise his hands or show any reaction, except a small nod, like Charlie had just confirmed something Bumpy already knew. "You didn't check it," Bumpy said quietly. "Didn't clean it, didn't maintain it. Probably got it wet on that freight train north and let rust get into the mechanism." Charlie stared at the useless metal in his hand like it had betrayed him personally. "That's the problem with men like you," Bumpy continued, taking a step closer. "You think the weapon makes you dangerous. Don't understand that the weapon is just a tool. And tools fail when you don't respect them." Charlie dropped the gun and lunged forward, hands reaching for Mayme like she was a shield he could hide behind. He made it 3 steps before Bumpy moved, and the movement was so fast Charlie didn't see it happen. Just felt the result. The straight razor opened a line across his left forearm from wrist to elbow. Not deep enough to hit arteries, but deep enough that blood started flowing immediately. Soaking his sleeve, dripping on Mayme's clean floor in red drops that looked black in the dim light. Charlie screamed and stumbled backward, clutching his arm, blood running between his fingers. Bumpy stood where he'd been, razor held loose in his right hand. No expression on his face except mild interest. "That's your reminder," Bumpy said. "So every time you look at your arm for the rest of your short life, you remember what happens when you touch what's mine. The cut wasn't fatal, wasn't even particularly dangerous if treated properly. But it was permanent. A scar that would last however many days Charlie had left before Georgia strapped him in the chair." Bumpy folded the razor and put it back in his pocket, then pulled out a white handkerchief and tossed it to Charlie. "Pressure on the wound," he said, "unless you want to bleed out before the cops get their paperwork done." Charlie pressed the handkerchief to his arm, tears and snot running down his face. All the fight gone out of him like air from a punctured tire. Mayme watched from her chair with the same calm expression she'd worn all morning. Bumpy walked to the door and knocked twice. "Henderson," he called. "We're done here." The door opened and 3 officers rushed in with guns drawn, saw Charlie bleeding and crying on the floor, saw Bumpy standing calm, with his hands visible and empty. "What happened?" Henderson demanded. "He attacked my wife," Bumpy said. "I defended her. Cut him with a letter opener from the desk." He gestured toward a small desk in the corner where a metal letter opener sat in plain view. And if Henderson noticed, it had no blood on it. He didn't mention that fact in his report. The officers grabbed Charlie, cuffed him, dragged him to his feet. One of them looked at the cut, saw it was superficial, and wrapped it with gauze from a first aid kit without much care for Charlie's whimpering. They read him his rights in voices that suggested they didn't care if he understood them or not. Outside, the crowd watched in continued silence as Charlie Morrison was shoved into the back of a police car, bleeding and broken and alive only because Bumpy Johnson had chosen mercy. But mercy in Harlem wasn't the same as mercy in churches or courtrooms. It was calculated, strategic, designed to send messages that killing couldn't send. Dead men tell no stories, but scarred men tell stories forever. Every time Charlie looked at his arm in his cell, every time other inmates asked about the scar, every time the prison doctor changed his bandages, the story would be told again. The story of the man who touched Bumpy Johnson's wife and lived just long enough to regret it. The police car pulled away with sirens silent. The crowd began dispersing, returning to their lives with a new story to tell. Inside the shop, Mayme stood and looked at the blood on her floor. "I'll need to clean that before it stains," she said. Bumpy nodded. "I'll help," he said. and together they cleaned the blood with soap and hot water. And when they were done, you couldn't tell anything had happened there at all. 8 seconds. That's how long it took from Charlie pulling the trigger to Bumpy opening his arm. 8 seconds that proved strength isn't about killing. It's about control. About choosing when to kill and when not to. About understanding that sometimes letting a man live wounded is more powerful than letting him die whole. In those 8 seconds, Bumpy Johnson proved what Harlem already knew. He didn't need to kill to maintain power. He just needed to remind people what happened when they forgot whose territory they were in. February 12th, 1952. 1:30 in the afternoon. Police Precinct 28 West 123rd Street. Captain Robert Henderson sat at his desk with Charlie Morrison's arrest report in front of him and tried to decide how much truth to include. The truth was complicated. The truth involved a hostage situation that ended without police intervention. A crowd of 200 witnesses who somehow didn't witness anything useful. And a known criminal walking into an active crime scene and resolving it with a blade, while officers stood outside following orders they'd been given by a man with no legal authority to give orders. The truth would require explanations Henderson didn't want to give. Questions from downtown he didn't want to answer. Investigations into why Harlem operated under different rules than the rest of Manhattan, and why those rules seemed to work better than the official ones. So Henderson did what cops in Harlem had been doing for decades. He wrote a simpler version. The report said, Charlie Morrison, white male, age 26, fugitive from Georgia State Prison, entered Johnson Tailoring at approximately 11:45 a.m. Armed with a .38 caliber revolver. Subject took proprietor Mayme Johnson hostage. Demanded money. Mrs. Johnson's husband, Ellsworth Johnson, arrived during the incident and attempted to negotiate. Subject attacked Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson defended his wife using a letter opener from the desk, inflicting a non-fatal defensive wound to subject's left arm. Subject surrendered. No shots fired. No civilians injured. It was clean. Legal. Boring. It was also mostly lies. The letter opener hadn't been used. The razor had. Charlie hadn't attacked Mayme. He'd lunged in panic. Bumpy hadn't defended. He'd punished. But the lies served a purpose that truth couldn't serve. They maintained the fiction that police controlled Harlem. That official law mattered. That the system worked. And maintaining that fiction was more important than recording facts that would complicate the fiction beyond repair. Henderson signed the report and passed it to Officer Davies for filing. Davies read it, looked up with confusion on his young face. Captain, this isn't what I know. What it isn't, Henderson interrupted. File it anyway. But the crowd, Davies said. The way Johnson just walked in and the crowd was observing a police operation, Henderson said. That's not illegal. And Mr. Johnson is a concerned citizen who helped resolve a dangerous situation. That's commendable, not criminal. We should thank him. Davies opened his mouth to argue, saw Henderson's expression, and closed it again. He filed the report without further comment. In the holding cell downstairs, Charlie Morrison sat on a concrete bench with his arm bandaged and his future measured in days. Georgia had already been notified. Extradition papers were being prepared. Within a week, he'd be back on death row. And within a month, the state would finish what it started in October. A public defender visited him that afternoon. A tired woman in her 40s who'd seen 1,000 cases like his and knew how they all ended. She asked about the cut on his arm. Charlie said he didn't remember how it happened. She asked if he wanted to contest extradition. Charlie said no. She asked if he had family to notify. Charlie said no to that too. Then he sat in silence while she explained procedures he wasn't listening to. The truth was, Charlie did remember how he got the cut. Remembered the razor opening his skin. Remembered Bumpy Johnson's face, showing nothing except mild interest. Remembered understanding that he'd been marked like cattle for everyone to see. But telling that truth meant admitting weakness. Meant admitting he'd been disarmed and cut by a man who didn't even break stride doing it. Meant becoming a story that would follow him to the execution chamber and beyond. So Charlie kept quiet. Let the official story stand. Letter opener, self-defense, simple and clean. The lie protected what little dignity he had left. And in the end, dignity was all any man had when everything else was gone. The system accepted his silence because the system preferred lies it could process to truths it couldn't handle. 3 days later, Charlie Morrison was on a train to Georgia with 2 U.S. Marshals who didn't speak to him or each other. The train rattled south through Virginia and the Carolinas, and Charlie watched the landscape change from industrial to rural, from north to south, from temporary reprieve to permanent conclusion. His arm throbbed under the bandages. The cut was healing, but the scar would remain. Just like Bumpy said it would. Justice isn't always fair. Sometimes it's just convenient. Sometimes it's just whatever keeps the machinery running smooth without asking too many questions. Charlie Morrison would die in the electric chair on April 18, 1952, and the official record would show he died for killing a cop in Valdosta. The unofficial record, the one that mattered in Harlem, would show he died for touching Bumpy Johnson's wife. Both records were true. Both records were incomplete. But only one record would be filed in courts and remembered in history. The other record would live in barbershops and pool halls and street corners, passed down through generations as a reminder that in Harlem, there are laws written in books and laws written in blood, and knowing which one applies in any given moment is the difference between living and dying stupid. Georgia State Prison, April 16, 1952. 2 days before execution. Charlie Morrison stood in front of the cracked mirror in his cell and studied the scar on his left arm. 3 months of healing had turned it from an open wound to a raised line of white tissue that ran from wrist to elbow. Not deep enough to cause permanent damage. Not shallow enough to fade. Perfect in its permanence. Deliberate in its placement. Every time he moved his arm, he felt it pull. A constant reminder that he'd made a mistake and lived just long enough to regret it. The other inmates asked about it. Asked during meals in the cafeteria. Asked during exercise in the yard. Asked through bars when guards weren't listening. What happened? They'd say, "How'd you get cut?" Charlie had a dozen lies prepared. Bar fight, prison riot, accident with machinery. But he never used them because lies required energy he didn't have. So he said nothing, and the silence made the scar more interesting than any explanation could have been. They assumed things. Assumed he'd fought someone dangerous and lost. Assumed he'd crossed the wrong people and been punished. Assumed the scar meant he was tough or stupid or unlucky. All their assumptions were wrong, but Charlie let them assume anyway, because the truth was worse. The truth was he'd been cut by a man who barely looked at him while doing it. Cut as an afterthought. Cut as a lesson. And lessons delivered that casually were more humiliating than beatings delivered with rage. 93 days since Harlem. 93 days of counting hours and watching the calendar and knowing exactly when his time would end. April 18th at midnight, they'd told him. April 18th, they'd strap him in the chair and send electricity through his body until his heart stopped and his brain died. And whatever made Charlie Morrison a person ceased to exist. 2 more days, 48 hours, 2,880 minutes. He'd stopped counting seconds because seconds made it worse. The prison chaplain visited on April 15th, asked if Charlie wanted to confess his sins before meeting his maker. Charlie laughed. Not from humor, but from the absurdity of the question. Which sins? he said. "The cop I killed by accident, or the woman I threatened on purpose, or the life I wasted being nothing. The chaplain said God forgives all sins if you're truly repentant." Charlie said he wasn't repentant, just tired. The chaplain left, looking relieved he didn't have to pretend to care anymore. His last meal request was bourbon and cigarettes, which they denied for obvious reasons. So he requested steak and eggs, which they'd bring him on April 18th at 6 hours before execution. He wouldn't be able to eat it. Condemned men rarely could. But requesting it was tradition, and tradition mattered even when nothing else did, especially when nothing else did. On April 17th, his last full day alive, Charlie sat on his bunk and thought about Harlem, thought about the tailor shop with white curtains and the woman who'd sat calm while he waved a gun, thought about Bumpy Johnson walking in without fear or hurry, like time itself had bent to accommodate him. Thought about the razor opening his arm and the understanding that came with the pain that he'd never been the predator he'd thought he was. He'd been prey from the start. He just hadn't known enough to run. The scar itched. Charlie scratched it through his prison uniform and wondered if Bumpy Johnson ever thought about him. Probably not. Men like Bumpy didn't waste thoughts on men like Charlie. They delivered lessons and moved on, secure in the knowledge that the lesson would be remembered by everyone who mattered. The scar was the lesson. Every time someone saw it, every time they asked about it, every time Charlie refused to explain, the lesson spread. Don't touch what isn't yours. Don't cross borders you don't understand. Don't assume silence means weakness. Meanwhile, in Harlem, life continued exactly as it had before Charlie Morrison stumbled into it. Mayme Johnson opened her tailor shop the morning after the incident, served customers who'd heard the story and customers who hadn't, altered suits and hemmed dresses and listened to gossip that became history. Bumpy Johnson ran his numbers and settled disputes and maintained order through a combination of reputation and strategic violence that kept the machine running smooth. The 200 witnesses dispersed back to their lives, but they carried the story with them, told it in barbershops and churches and kitchen tables, told their children who would tell their children. The story of the day a white man with a gun learned that in Harlem, the law worked different. That power didn't come from weapons or badges or constitutions. It came from community, from collective understanding, from 200 people deciding what was acceptable and what wasn't. Charlie Morrison died at 12:04 a.m. on April 18th, 1952. The electric chair did its job efficiently. His last words were, "I'm sorry," though he never specified who he was apologizing to or what he was sorry for. The prison recorded his death, filed the paperwork, and moved on to the next execution scheduled for May. In Harlem, nobody noticed. Nobody marked the date or mourned the passing, or thought about the white man who'd made a mistake 93 days earlier. Life continued. Orders were maintained, and the unwritten laws that governed the kingdom remained unbroken. Because in Harlem, 1952 power didn't rest in the blade. It rested in the 200 people standing silent behind it, bearing witness, maintaining order, proving that community could be stronger than violence and silence could be louder than guns. The scar Charlie carried to his grave was never photographed or documented, but the lesson it taught lived on, passed down through generations. A reminder that some borders shouldn't be crossed and some mistakes can't be survived us. Charlie Morrison bled out his last breath in Georgia's electric chair while Mayme Johnson hemmed a wedding dress in Harlem. Nobody connected the two events because in the end, Charlie never mattered enough to remember. The lesson isn't about violence. It's about understanding that the most dangerous power doesn't announce itself. It waits. It watches. It moves only when necessary and never more than required. If you were Bumpy Johnson standing in that shop with a razor in your pocket and 200 witnesses outside, what would you have done? Left him breathing or left him cold? Drop your answer in the comments below. Hit subscribe if you want more stories the history books won't tell you. Tomorrow, another file opens. Another moment when power shifted hands in back rooms where laws were written in blood instead of ink. Another truth hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to remember it. See you then.